You think ground beef in the 1970s just meant a plain hamburger patty on a bun every night? Those kitchens knew better. A single pound was the most versatile thing in the refrigerator, and the women standing at those stoves stretched it into suppers that would outperform most of what passes for dinner today. One dish halfway down this countdown crossed the Atlantic from Eastern Europe and sparked an argument between families from Pittsburgh to Milwaukee that never got settled. And the gravy on number 9 came out so dark it turned a plain beef patty into the finest plate on the table. These meals did not come from cookbooks. They came from counters where the math had to work every single night. Here are 30 forgotten ground beef suppers from the 1970s people really ate. Number 30. Beef and rice skillet. Brown a pound of ground beef in a cast iron skillet, toss in a cup of uncooked rice, a can of tomato sauce, a cup of water, salt, and pepper. Put the lid on and walk away. In 20 minutes, you had a one-pan supper that stuck to your ribs and left exactly one dish to wash. Families across the South and the Midwest made this 2 or 3 nights a week because it needed nothing special and filled everyone at the table. Some threw in a diced onion at the start. Some stirred in a handful of frozen peas near the end. The recipe changed from kitchen to kitchen, but the idea never did. 1 pound of meat, 1 pot, 1 burner, and everybody ate. Number 29. Wet burritos. Brown ground beef with diced onion, garlic, chili powder, and cumin. Then fold the seasoned meat into flour tortillas with refried beans and shredded cheddar. Line them up in a baking dish, pour enchilada sauce and a second layer of cheese over the top, and bake until the sauce soaked through the tortillas and the cheese on top turned golden. The tortillas went soft and heavy under that blanket of sauce, which is why people called them wet. They needed a fork, not 2 hands. Tex-Mex restaurants across the Southwest served them by the pan, but the homemade version cost a fraction and fed a table of 5 from a single pound of beef. Before I go any further, for the folks who enjoy old suppers like these and want a whole collection of them gathered together, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It has recipes just like the ones in this countdown, meals that earned a spot at the table once and deserve another. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 28. Poor man's steak. Take a pound of ground beef, work in some crushed saltine crackers, an egg, salt, and pepper, then shape it into a thick rectangle and slice it into portions that looked like real steaks. Dredge each one in flour and fry them in a hot skillet until a dark crust formed on both sides. Then pour a can of cream of mushroom soup over the top, add a little water, cover, and let the whole thing braise low and slow until the meat went tender. The flour crust soaked up that gravy and became the best part of the plate. A family of 4 could eat this for a fraction of what a real steak dinner cost, and half of them never knew the difference. The name told you everything about who this dish was made for. Number 27. Sloppy Joes. Brown ground beef with diced onion and green pepper in a skillet. Then stir in ketchup, a splash of vinegar, a spoonful of mustard, a pinch of brown sugar, and enough Worcestershire to darken the whole pan. Let it simmer until the sauce thickened and clung to every crumble of meat. Spoon it onto a soft hamburger bun and press the top down until the juice soaked through the bread. Every school cafeteria in the country served a version of this, but the ones made at home were different. The meat was real, the bun was fresh, and the ratio was whatever your mother decided it should be. Some families added a can of tomato soup instead of ketchup. Others threw in a diced celery stalk for crunch nobody asked for, but nobody refused. The name came from a loose meat sandwich shop in Sioux City, Iowa, and by the 1970s, every household with children had a version scribbled on an index card, or just memorized. Number 26. Hamburger soup. Ground beef browned with diced onion, covered with water, and loaded with whatever vegetables were sitting in the crisper drawer. Carrots, celery, potatoes, a can of corn, a can of green beans, a bay leaf if you had one. It simmered for an hour and turned into something between a soup and a stew, thick enough to eat with a fork but loose enough to soak a piece of bread. This was the supper that showed up when the paycheck was 3 days away. A pot fed a family of 6 for 2 nights running, and on the second night, it tasted better. Number 25. Hamburger stroganoff. Brown ground beef with sliced onion in a deep skillet, stir in a can of cream of mushroom soup, a carton of sour cream, and a shake of garlic powder. Let it simmer while the egg noodles boiled in a separate pot, then pour the whole creamy mess over the noodles and serve it straight from the stove. This was the weeknight answer to a dish that used to require beef tenderloin and a full afternoon. Somewhere between the 1950s and the 1970s, American home cooks figured out that ground beef did the same job for a fraction of the cost, and nobody at the table complained. The sour cream made the sauce rich enough to feel like a special occasion, even on a Wednesday. Families in the Midwest served this so often that some of them stopped calling it stroganoff and just called it the noodle thing. Number 24. Picadillo. Ground beef browned with onion and garlic, simmered in tomato sauce with green olives, raisins, and a shake of cumin. The olives made it salty. The raisins made it sweet. The combination sounded strange to people who had never tasted it and made perfect sense to everyone who had. Cuban-American families across South Florida served picadillo over white rice as a weeknight standard, and it traveled north through the 1970s as people moved and carried their recipes with them. A single skillet fed the table, and the leftovers tasted better cold the next day spooned into a tortilla. The arithmetic of ground beef. A pound of ground beef cost roughly 50 cents in most American grocery stores at the start of the 1970s. By the middle of the decade, it had crossed $1 for the first time, and families that had been buying 2 or 3 pounds a week suddenly found themselves stretching 1 pound across the same number of meals. That single shift reshaped how a whole country cooked supper. Casseroles got deeper. Soups got thicker. Rice and noodles stopped being side dishes and became the foundation, with ground beef stirred in for substance rather than stacked on as the main attraction. Every recipe on this list is a direct answer to that arithmetic. The women who built these meals were solving a math problem at the kitchen counter every evening without a calculator or a complaint. Number 23. Shipwreck casserole. You layered everything into a baking dish in order. Raw sliced potatoes on the bottom, then chopped onion, then raw ground beef crumbled apart, then a can of kidney beans, then a can of tomato soup poured over the whole thing undiluted. You did not stir it. You did not mix anything. You put the lid on and let the oven handle it for about 90 minutes. The name came from the idea that every last thing in the pantry went down with the ship. When you pulled it out, the potatoes on the bottom had gone soft in the drippings, and the soup had turned into a thick sauce that held every layer together. No prep, no technique, no second thought required. Number 22. Spanish rice with ground beef. Brown ground beef with onion and green pepper. Stir in a can of tomato sauce, a cup of uncooked rice, water, chili powder, and a pinch of cumin. Cover the skillet, turn the heat down, and let the rice absorb everything until each grain turned red and swollen with flavor. The dish came together in one pan, fed a full table, and cost almost nothing. Families in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona made it weekly, but it spread far beyond the Southwest because the ingredients were cheap and the method was simple. The tomato turned the rice a deep orange that children found exciting and adults found comforting. Some added a handful of corn or a diced jalapeno. Others left it plain and served it with a stack of warm tortillas on the side. Either way, the pot was empty before the dishes started. Number 21. Beef croquettes. Leftover ground beef mixed with mashed potatoes, a beaten egg, minced onion, and a heavy pinch of salt, shaped into thick cylinders, rolled in breadcrumbs, and fried in a 1/4 inch of hot oil until the outside turned golden and crunchy. The inside stayed soft and warm, and the potato held the beef together so each croquette sliced clean with a fork. Families made these on the second night, after the first pound of beef had already done its duty in a skillet supper or a casserole. Nothing went to waste. The breadcrumb shell gave them a crunch that made children think they were eating something fancy, and nobody corrected them. Number 20. Runza. A pocket of soft bread dough, stuffed with seasoned ground beef, shredded cabbage and onion, pinched shut, and baked until the crust turned golden brown. The filling steamed inside the dough as it cooked, so the first bite released a rush of heat and the smell of cabbage and beef together. Nebraska families ate these the way other families ate sandwiches, one in each hand, standing at the counter between chores. The recipe came from German-Russian immigrants who settled the Great Plains generations earlier, and by the 1970s, every church supper and school cafeteria in the state had its own version. The dough soaked up the juices from the meat, and the bottom of each pocket was always the best bite. Number 19. Beef and corn casserole, brown ground beef with onion, spread it into a baking dish, layer canned corn kernels on top, and pour a mixture of eggs, milk, salt, and pepper over everything. Bake until the egg mixture set firm and the edges turned crispy. The corn floated up through the custard as it baked, so every slice had pockets of sweetness scattered through the savory beef below. This was a supper that appeared on tables across the Midwest when corn was cheap, which was just about always. Some cooks crushed cornflakes over the top for a crunch. Others skipped the pretense and ate it plain. The women at the counter. Most of the women who made these suppers never received a word of credit for them. They did not write cookbooks. They did not appear on television programs. They stood at a stove between laundry loads and homework questions and fed people who arrived at the table expecting something hot, and they delivered it every single night on a budget that would embarrass a modern grocery receipt. Ground beef was their workhorse. It browned fast, it stretched far, it absorbed whatever seasoning you threw at it, and it forgave every shortcut and every substitution. A woman who turned 1 pound of ground beef into supper for 6 was performing a daily act of quiet arithmetic that nobody noticed until she was no longer there to do it. Number 18. Cheeseburger pie. Brown ground beef with chopped onion, spread it into a pie plate, pour a mixture of eggs, milk, and shredded cheddar over the top, and bake it until the filling set firm like a quiche. When you sliced into it, every piece held its shape, and every bite tasted like a cheeseburger without the bun. The recipe circulated on index cards and church bulletins through the 1970s and showed up at potlucks labeled with half a dozen different names. Some versions skipped the crust entirely and used biscuit batter that formed its own bottom as it baked. Either way, it turned the idea of a cheeseburger into something you could eat at the dining room table with a fork. Number 17. Johnny Marzetti. Brown ground beef with diced onion and garlic. Stir in a can of tomato sauce, a can of tomato paste, cooked elbow macaroni, and a generous layer of shredded cheddar on top. Bake it until the cheese bubbled and the edges turned golden brown. The dish was named after the brother of a woman who ran a restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, and by the 1970s it had become a church supper staple across the entire state. School cafeterias served it under fluorescent lights on metal trays, and the children who ate it there went home and asked their mothers to make it again. The beauty of it was that nothing needed to be precise. More cheese, less tomato, extra noodles, it all worked. You put it on the table in the same baking dish it cooked in, and everybody served themselves until the spoon scraped the bottom. Number 16. Crescent roll beef bake. Brown ground beef with onion and garlic. Stir in a can of tomato paste, salt, and Italian seasoning, then spread the mixture into a baking dish. Unroll a tube of refrigerated crescent roll dough across the top, pinch the seams together, and brush the surface with melted butter. Bake until the dough puffed up golden and the beef filling bubbled underneath. The moment Pillsbury put those crescent roll tubes on grocery shelves in the late 1960s, home cooks turned them into everything. This version became a Thursday night standard because it looked like you had spent an hour in the kitchen when in truth the oven did all the work in 20 minutes. The crust tore apart in soft, buttery sheets, and every piece came away with a stripe of seasoned beef underneath. Number 15. Skillet beef and green beans. Brown ground beef in a wide skillet with sliced onion, then add 2 cans of green beans, drained, a splash of soy sauce, and a pinch of garlic powder. Let it cook together until the green beans softened and the soy sauce turned everything in the pan a shade darker. The dish had no fancy name and no recipe card. It existed because green beans were the cheapest canned vegetable on the shelf and ground beef was already in the skillet from the night before. What made it work was the soy sauce. That one ingredient lifted the whole plate out of plainness and into something people actually wanted seconds of. Families in military housing made this constantly because commissary shelves always had canned green beans and ground beef in rotation. The wives traded the recipe across base housing fences and back porches, and each one adjusted the soy sauce to her own family's taste. Some added a can of cream of mushroom soup to turn it into a casserole. Others kept it loose in the skillet and served it over rice. A few families in the upper Midwest stirred in canned mushrooms alongside the green beans and served the whole thing over egg noodles, turning a side dish into the centerpiece of a weeknight table. The children never knew it was the same pound of beef from the night before, reheated and stretched into a second life with nothing more than a can opener and a hot burner. Nobody wrote this recipe down because there was nothing to write. A pound of ground beef, 2 cans from the pantry shelf, and a bottle of soy sauce that lasted 3 months. The skillet got washed, the stove got wiped, and the same question came back the next evening. Number 14. Baked ziti with ground beef. Cook ziti until just short of tender brown ground beef with garlic and onion, stir in a jar of marinara sauce, fold the noodles through, and pour the whole thing into a deep baking dish. Cover it with a thick layer of shredded mozzarella and a spoonful of ricotta dropped in small clouds across the top. Bake it until the cheese bubbled and browned at the edges. Italian-American families on the East Coast served baked ziti at every gathering that mattered, and by the 1970s, the dish had spread into kitchens that had no Italian heritage at all. The noodles held together in a dense, cheesy mass that tasted like sundae. And Number 13. Cowboy beans. Brown ground beef with diced onion in a Dutch oven, add a can of pork and beans, a can of kidney beans, a squirt of mustard, a pour of ketchup, and a spoonful of brown sugar. Stir it all together, slide it into the oven, and let it bake until the sauce turned dark and sticky and the kitchen smelled like a backyard cookout. This was the covered dish that showed up at every potluck, every block party, and every 4th of July picnic table from Texas to Montana. The brown sugar and ketchup made a glaze that clung to the beans and the beef, and the whole thing held its heat for an hour after it came out of the oven. You served it with cornbread or white bread or nothing at all, and nobody left a spoonful in the dish. What the meals were for. There is something people overlook when they list old recipes. Every single one of these suppers was an answer to a question that started the same way. What are we going to eat tonight? Not what do we feel like having. Not what does the recipe suggest. What can we afford? What is in the pantry? And how fast can it reach the table? That question landed on the same person in the same kitchen at the same hour every day, and she answered it without hesitation 365 times a year. These ground beef suppers were not chosen because they were delicious, although most of them were. They were chosen because they were possible. And making the possible taste good, night after night, on a budget that left nothing to spare, is a kind of skill that never earned a title or a paycheck. Number 12. Stuffed zucchini boats. Split zucchini lengthwise, scoop out the seeds with a spoon, and fill the hollow with a mixture of browned ground beef, breadcrumbs, parmesan, diced tomato, and Italian seasoning. Lay them in a baking dish, cover with foil, and bake until the squash softened and the filling crusted on top. By the middle of summer, backyard gardens produced more zucchini than any family could eat, and this was the recipe that used them up without complaint. The squash itself was mild enough to disappear under the seasoned beef, and children who claimed they hated vegetables ate these without realizing what held the filling together. One large zucchini made 2 boats, and 4 boats fed a family of 4 with nothing else on the table. Number 11. Beef stuffed baked tomatoes. Scoop the centers out of large ripe tomatoes. Fill each one with a mixture of browned ground beef, cooked rice, minced onion, and the chopped tomato pulp you just removed. Set them upright in a baking dish and bake until the tomato walls went soft and the filling heated through. The juice from the tomato ran into the rice as it cooked and flavored the filling from the inside out. Summer kitchens made these when the garden was producing more tomatoes than anyone knew what to do with. A row of stuffed tomatoes in a glass dish looked like a meal somebody planned. Most of the time, it was a meal somebody improvised because the beef was thawed and the tomatoes were about to go. Number 10. Tater tot casserole. Ground beef browned with onion, spread into a baking dish, covered with a can of cream of mushroom soup, and topped with a single even layer of frozen tater tots. Baked until the tots turned golden and the soup underneath became a thick, savory gravy. Midwestern families served this once a week without a shred of apology. The tots on top formed a crust that crunched when you broke through it, and the layer of soup and beef below was soft, rich, and deeply satisfying. Children loved it because it had tater tots on top. Adults loved it because the whole thing took 10 minutes to put together. Everybody loved it because it tasted far better than it had any right to. Number 9. Hamburger steak with onion gravy. Take a pound of ground beef, divide it into thick patties seasoned with nothing but salt and pepper, and sear them in a cast iron skillet until a deep brown crust formed on both sides. Pull the patties out, drop sliced onions into the same pan, and let them cook slowly in the beef drippings until they turned soft and golden and sweet. Sprinkle in some flour, pour in beef broth, and let the gravy build right there in the skillet with the onions dissolving into it. Set the patties back in, spoon that gravy over every surface, and let the whole thing simmer on low heat until the beef was tender all the way through. The gravy came out dark, almost brown-black in the pan, and it clung to everything it touched. Served on a plate next to a pile of mashed potatoes, the gravy ran across the plate and pooled under the starch, and the first forkful brought meat, onion, salt, and potato all together in one bite. And this was the supper that appeared on nights when the family needed something solid and complete and real. No casserole to assemble, no crust to bake, no sauce from a can. Just a skillet, a pound of beef, and a bag of yellow onions. The smell of those onions browning in cast iron could pull a person in from the far end of the house without a word being spoken. Nobody set a timer. You watched the color of the onions and you knew. When they turned the shade of old honey and started to fall apart in the pan, the gravy was ready. The women who made this did not follow a recipe. They followed the sound of the sizzle and the look of the fond on the bottom of the skillet, and they never once reached for a cookbook. Number 8. Barbecue beef sandwiches. Brown ground beef in a heavy pot, drain the grease and stir in ketchup, brown sugar, vinegar, a spoonful of mustard, and Worcestershire sauce. Let it simmer on low heat until the sauce thickened and clung to every crumble of meat. Spoon it onto toasted hamburger buns and serve with a stack of napkins. This was not the same thing as a sloppy Joe. The sauce was darker, sweeter, and had a smokiness from the vinegar and the sugar cooking down together that gave it a backyard flavor without ever touching a grill. Church fellowship halls in the Midwest served trays of these at every gathering where more than 20 people walked through the door. The pot kept warm on the stove for hours. Number 7. Cottage pie. Ground beef cooked with onion, peas, diced carrots, and a thick gravy spread into a baking dish and blanketed with a heavy layer of mashed potatoes. Baked until the potatoes turned golden on top and the filling bubbled up around the edges. The mashed potato lid trapped the steam from the meat filling underneath. So the moment you broke through the top with a spoon, everything below was hot, wet, and loaded with flavor. One dish fed the entire table and used up any leftover mashed potatoes sitting in the refrigerator from the night before. It was economy and comfort fused into a single baking dish. Where the suppers went. Ground beef suppers did not disappear because people stopped enjoying them. They disappeared because the kitchen changed around them. Microwaves replaced ovens. Drive-through windows replaced dining tables. The window between arriving home and eating shrank to nothing when takeout became faster than boiling water. The women who carried the arithmetic of feeding a family got older, and their children grew up ordering on screens instead of opening the refrigerator. But the meals never broke. A skillet of ground beef and onions cooked in 1974 would taste the same if you made it this evening. The recipes are still here. The math still works. The only thing missing is the person who used to stand at the stove. Number 6. Deep dish pizza casserole. Press a layer of refrigerated crescent roll dough into the bottom of a baking dish. Brown ground beef with onion and garlic, stir in pizza sauce, and spread the meat mixture over the dough. Layer mozzarella cheese and sliced pepperoni on top, then drape a second sheet of crescent dough over everything. Bake until the top crust turned golden and the cheese underneath stretched when you cut into it. This was the answer families gave when children asked for pizza and the budget said no to delivery. The crescent dough baked crisp on the bottom and soft on top, and the whole casserole sliced into squares that held together long enough to eat with your hands. Number 5. Beef and potato cakes. Leftover ground beef and leftover mashed potatoes mixed together with a beaten egg, diced onion, salt, and pepper. Shaped into flat patties and fried in a skillet with a thin layer of oil until both sides turned golden brown and crispy. The outside crackled when you bit through it, and the inside was soft and savory. These appeared on tables the night after a bigger supper, when the refrigerator held just enough of two things to make a third. Nobody planned beef and potato cakes. They happened because the cook refused to let leftovers go to waste. A side of canned green beans or a scoop of applesauce made it a complete plate. Number 4. Beef and potato hash. Dice leftover boiled potatoes into small cubes, brown ground beef in a cast iron skillet with diced onion. Toss the potatoes in and press the whole thing flat against the hot surface. Let it sit without stirring until the bottom turned crisp and golden, then flip it in sections and let the other side do the same. Crack an egg on top if you had one. This was the meal that turned leftovers into something worth sitting down for. Families who kept a pot of boiled potatoes in the icebox all week used them for this more than anything else. The crisp bottom was the whole point, that layer of browned potato and beef fused together by heat and patience. You ate it straight from the skillet with a fork and a bottle of ketchup, and the only sound at the table was the scrape of metal on cast iron. Number 3. Porcupine meatballs. Mix ground beef with uncooked rice, diced onion, an egg, salt, and pepper. Then roll the mixture into balls the size of a walnut. Nestle them into a baking dish, pour a can of tomato soup thinned with water over the top, and bake until the rice poked out of the meatballs like tiny quills. That is where the name came from, and every child who heard it laughed the first time and remembered it forever. The rice cooked inside the meat, absorbing the beef drippings and the tomato all at once, so each meatball held its own sauce inside it. Mothers loved this recipe because the rice stretched a single pound of ground beef into enough meatballs for a family of 6. The leftovers reheated better than the original because the rice softened overnight and the tomato sank deeper into the meat. This was not a fancy supper. It was the kind of meal a woman made on a Tuesday when the groceries had to last until Friday. Number 2. Beef enchiladas. Ground beef seasoned with cumin and chili powder, rolled inside soft corn tortillas, lined up side by side in a baking dish, blanketed in enchilada sauce and shredded cheese, and baked until the cheese bubbled and the tortillas softened into the sauce beneath them. Mexican-American families across the Southwest had been making enchiladas for generations before the 1970s. But during that decade, the dish crossed every regional boundary and landed in kitchens where the cooks had never traveled south of Kansas City. The enchilada sauce came from a can. The tortillas came from a grocery shelf. Nobody apologized for that. A full pan of beef enchiladas fed 6 people on a weeknight and still felt like something worth celebrating. Number 1. Ground beef and potatoes. A pound of ground beef browned in a skillet with cubed potatoes, a sliced onion, salt, and pepper. No sauce, no casserole dish, no crust on top, and no recipe card anywhere in sight. You stood at the stove and watched the potatoes go golden and the beef go brown and the onion go soft, and when everything was done, you put it on a plate and sat down at the table. This was the supper that existed before all the others. Your mother made it. Her mother made it before her. It has no origin story and no chapter in any cookbook ever printed. Some called it hash. Some called it skillet supper. Most people just called it ground beef and potatoes. It was the last meal standing when the pantry was bare and the budget was gone, and it never let a family go to bed hungry. Stuffed green peppers made a quarter pound of ground beef look like abundance. You sliced the tops off 4 large peppers, stood them upright in a baking dish, and packed them tight with a filling of ground beef stretched with cooked white rice, sometimes equal parts, sometimes more rice than meat when money was short. 1 can of Campbell's tomato soup went over the top, thinned with a half can of water, and the dish baked for close to an hour. The pepper softened and sweetened. The rice expanded inside the filling. The sauce darkened at the pan's edges where it had caramelized. The USDA published stretching guides featuring stuffed peppers in 1930s budget bulletins as a formal protein extension strategy, but nobody needed the bulletin. 4 people, 4 peppers, a quarter pound of beef, 1 can of soup. You didn't need to know how to cook. You needed to know how to count. Number 26. Pizza burgers. You browned ground beef and stirred in a small can of tomato paste, a teaspoon of oregano, garlic powder, and a pinch of sugar. You spooned the mixture onto split hamburger buns, laid a slice of mozzarella on each one, and ran them under the broiler until the cheese bubbled and browned at the edges. Kids went wild for these because they tasted like pizza, but looked like something from a diner. A pound of beef made 8 open-face halves, which meant a family of 4 ate for the price of a single frozen pizza and had leftovers. The sugar in the tomato paste was the trick. It cut the acid and made the sauce taste rounder, almost sweet, exactly the way delivery pizza tasted. Before it became cafeteria food, Johnny Marzetti had a proper origin story. Teresa Marzetti, who ran a restaurant near Ohio State University in Columbus, created the dish in the early 20th century and named it after her brother-in-law. By the 1970s, the recipe had migrated so far from its restaurant roots that most people just called it that noodle casserole. The formula was ground beef browned with onions and green peppers, stirred into cooked elbow macaroni with canned tomato sauce, then topped with shredded American cheese and baked until bubbling. School cafeterias across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan served it by the tray, and PTA cookbooks listed it more often than almost any other main dish. What set it apart from generic hamburger noodle bakes was the green pepper. That slightly bitter crunch against soft noodles and rich meat sauce gave it a character plain casseroles lacked. At roughly 12 cents a serving in a school kitchen, it fed hundreds of children daily. Hamburger pie was never quite a quiche and never quite a casserole, and that in-between quality was exactly what made it so practical for women who built supper from scratch through the 1940s and 50s. You browned ground beef with onion, added whatever vegetables the refrigerator had left, poured the filling into a skillet lined with biscuit dough, laid more dough over the top, crimped the edges like a real pie, and baked it until the crust went golden. Betty Crocker published a version in the 1950s that spread it nationally. She made it on Thursdays, the day before payday, the day the refrigerator was at its most creative. Nobody makes hamburger pie on Thursdays anymore because nobody is counting days to payday in quite that way. The arithmetic has changed. The pie hasn't been seen since. Number 23. Beef and noodle bake. You cooked wide egg noodles until they were barely tender, browned a pound of ground beef with onion, and stirred in a can of cream of celery soup, a cup of sour cream, and salt and pepper. You folded the noodles into the meat mixture, poured it into a buttered dish, and topped it with crushed potato chips. 30 minutes at 350, and the chips turned golden while the noodles underneath stayed creamy. The sour cream kept everything from drying out, and the crunch on top gave every bite 2 textures. You could smell the potato chips browning from the living room, and that was usually when the kids started setting the table without being asked. The story goes that Ella Mae Hartline fell in love with tostadas while living in Arizona during the 1950s, and when she moved back to Iowa, where tortillas were nearly impossible to find, she improvised. What she created, layers of crushed saltine crackers topped with seasoned ground beef, shredded lettuce, diced tomatoes, cheese, and sour cream, became known as haystacks. And by the early 1970s, the dish had spread through Mennonite and Seventh-day Adventist church communities across the Midwest. The beauty was the assembly line. You set out bowls of each ingredient and let everyone build their own. Children loved the freedom. Adults loved that it fed 30 people with 2 pounds of hamburger and a mountain of cheap toppings. Some congregations served haystacks so frequently that members joked they could build one in their sleep. The dish sat somewhere between taco salad and nachos, belonging to neither tradition but borrowing from both. Communal eating at its most democratic, where no two plates looked alike. Stuffed cabbage rolls arrived in American kitchens packed inside the memory of women who had made them in the old country and had no intention of stopping. Golubki in Polish, töltot kaposta in Hungarian, the technique crossed the Atlantic with Eastern European immigrants who settled in the mill towns of Pennsylvania and the factory cities of Ohio. You blanched the cabbage leaves first, peeling them away from the head as they softened in boiling water. That step was what separated those who knew the dish from those who were guessing. Ground beef and cooked rice went inside each leaf, seasoned simply, rolled tight and folded at the ends, then layered in a pot and covered in tomato sauce. In Depression-era kitchens, 1 can of condensed tomato soup thinned with water kept the dish alive when old country ingredients cost too much. 2 hours over the lowest flame, until the cabbage and the filling became one thing you couldn't separate. Number 21. Hamburger vegetable soup. You browned a pound of ground beef, poured off the grease, and dumped in a quart of water. A can of diced tomatoes, diced potatoes, sliced carrots, chopped celery, half a cup of barley, and whatever else was in the crisper drawer. Salt, pepper, a bay leaf. You let it simmer for an hour while the barley swelled and thickened the broth. By the time it was ready, you had a full pot of soup that tasted like your grandmother had been cooking all day, when really, you had just opened the refrigerator and used what was left. The barley was the difference between this and regular vegetable soup. It gave the broth body, turned it from thin and watery into something that stuck to the spoon. Ground beef cost about 60 cents a pound in 1970, and by the end of the decade, it had climbed past $1. That does not sound like much now, but wages did not keep up, and grocery bills were the first thing a family felt when prices moved. Women who had grown up during the Depression already knew how to handle it. They had watched their mothers turn a quarter pound of meat into a full casserole by adding rice, potatoes, or day-old bread. The 1970s just gave them another reason to use those same skills. The recipes on this list are not nostalgic curiosities. They are engineering, built by people who understood that wasting food was not an option and that every ounce of protein had to stretch as far as it could go. Family goulash bore almost no resemblance to the Hungarian original, but nobody in America seemed to mind. The version that appeared in the 1970s Betty Crocker cookbook called for ground beef browned with chopped onion, stirred together with cooked fine noodles, sliced celery, canned tomatoes, a half cup of catsup, and a jar of sliced mushrooms, then simmered covered for 30 to 45 minutes. It was pure Midwestern comfort, soft, tomatoey, and filling in a way that required zero culinary skill. The dish thrived because it used pantry staples that every household already owned, and it stretched a single pound of hamburger across 4 generous servings. Children who grew up eating it in the early 70s often remembered it as their favorite dinner without knowing what goulash actually was. The real beauty was the hands-off cooking. Once everything was in the skillet, you walked away and let time do the work. If tamale pie belonged to the Southwest, the hamburger and rice casserole belonged to every church basement from Ohio to Minnesota, and the women who made it knew something the recipe card never mentioned. You browned the ground beef with chopped celery and onion, combined it with pre-cooked white rice and a can of cream of mushroom soup thinned with a splash of milk, packed everything into a greased baking dish, covered it with cheddar, and baked it at 350 until the cheese browned. The timing mattered more than the ingredients. Pull it 5 minutes early and it was soupy. Leave it 5 minutes too long and the rice went dry at the corners. You didn't set a timer. You learned to smell when it was ready. That moment when the cheese stopped smelling raw and started smelling toasted. Church cookbooks from Ohio and Minnesota documented this casserole throughout the 1950s and 60s as the most reliably replicated dish at covered dish suppers. Anyone could make it. Not everyone could make it right. She could. Nobody at that church ever figured out quite why hers tasted different. Number 29. Hamburger corn pone pie. You browned ground beef with diced onion and stirred in a can of tomato sauce, a handful of chili powder, and a can of drained whole kernel corn. That went into a greased baking dish. On top, you spread a thick layer of cornbread batter, the kind made from yellow cornmeal, 1 egg, and a splash of milk. 25 minutes at 400 degrees, and the cornbread rose golden brown over a bubbling layer of spiced beef. It was a complete supper in one pan. The starch and the protein baked together, and the crust soaked up just enough juice to stay tender on the bottom while the top stayed dry and crumbly. Women in the rural South had been making versions of this since their grandmothers cooked over wood. What do you do when you need to feed 12 people on $1's worth of meat? You make calico beans. The dish got its name from the patchwork of colors: dark red kidney beans, pale butter beans, white navy beans, and pork and beans all tumbled together with browned ground beef, diced onion, and a sweet tangy sauce of brown sugar, vinegar, mustard, and ketchup. It stretched a half-pound of hamburger into a crowd-sized dish where nobody felt shortchanged. Slow-baked for an hour until the top caramelized and the juices thickened, calico beans became a potluck institution across Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Some families added bacon for smokiness. Others stirred in extra canned beans for body. It earned its place at the Fellowship Hall table by proving flavor had nothing to do with price. Porcupine meatballs looked like something a child imagined and a grandmother made real. You mixed raw long-grain rice directly into the raw ground beef. No pre-cooking, no soaking, along with diced onion, salt, and black pepper, and rolled the mixture into balls about the size of a golf ball. The uncooked rice was the trick. It swelled as it simmered, pushing outward through the meat into the quills that gave the dish its name. Into a pot of tomato sauce they went, lid on tight, 45 minutes over the lowest flame. The rice cooked inside the meatball from the beef's heat while the sauce worked its way in from outside, and by the time the lid came off, every grain had absorbed flavor from both directions at once. By the 1940s, porcupine meatballs appeared regularly in church community cookbooks from Pennsylvania to Oregon as a reliable way to stretch half a pound of ground beef into a full supper for 4 people. Nobody younger than 60 seems to know what they are. The recipe is still in the box, written in pencil on an index card that's starting to fade. Number 28. Spanish rice with ground beef. You browned a pound of ground beef with chopped onion and green pepper, drained the grease, then added a can of tomato sauce, a cup of uncooked rice, 2 cups of water, and a heavy shake of cumin and garlic powder. You covered the skillet and let it simmer for 20 minutes until the rice absorbed everything. The finished dish was brick red and fragrant, sticky enough to eat with a fork, and filling enough that nobody asked for seconds because there were none. Every family in the Southwest had their own version, and they all tasted like Wednesday night. The green pepper was the tell. If you could smell green pepper cooking from the sidewalk, you knew somebody in that house was making Spanish rice. In small towns across the Great Plains, porcupine meatballs were a Tuesday night staple that children either loved or dreaded. The name came from raw rice mixed into the ground beef before shaping. The grains poked out in tiny white spikes after simmering in tomato sauce, giving each meatball the look of a tiny, edible porcupine. The recipe survived from the Depression, when mixing rice into meat was survival rather than whimsy. But by the early 1970s, it belonged to frugal cooks who knew a cup of rice could turn 1 pound of hamburger into enough meatballs for 6. Combine the beef with rice, egg, chopped onion, salt, and pepper. Roll into balls, brown in a skillet, then nestle them into canned tomato soup thinned with water. Covered and simmered for 45 minutes, the rice swelled, the meat stayed tender, and the sauce thickened into something rich and deeply tomatoey. Johnny Marzetti had a specific name, which meant it came from somewhere real, and it did. Teresa Marzetti ran a Columbus, Ohio restaurant in the 1920s, and her casserole of ground beef, egg noodles, tomato sauce, and sharp cheddar became so popular at church suppers and school lunches across the Midwest that her name traveled with the recipe for 50 years after the restaurant itself had closed. You browned the beef with onion, combined it with cooked egg noodles and tomato sauce, covered it generously with cheddar, and baked it until the cheese had browned and the whole dish had set. But the proportions mattered. Too much sauce and it went soupy, too little and it dried out, and you learned those proportions by watching, not by reading. The first time you made it alone, you called home to ask about the sauce, and the answer was always, enough. That was the complete instruction. Johnny Marzetti fed Ohio church basements for 4 decades. Then lasagna arrived, and the egg noodles never came back. She always bought the cheapest tube of ground beef at the store, the one nobody else wanted because it looked ugly. My grandmother stretched that 1 pound into 3 different meals before the week was over. She never owned a cookbook. Ground beef was the one thing every family could afford in the 1970s, and the women who cooked with it turned a few cents worth of meat into suppers that held a household together. Number 19 on this list was a recipe her church circle traded like currency. And number 7 sat on tables from Ohio to Oklahoma, and most people alive today have never heard of it. These were not fancy meals. They were proof that feeding a family well had nothing to do with money. The smell hit you before you saw the chafing dish. Sweet, tangy, faintly smoky, with a glossiness that caught the light from across the room. Grape jelly cocktail meatballs were the unlikely star of every 1970s dinner party, baby shower, and neighborhood open house. The recipe sounded absurd. 1 jar of grape jelly, 1 bottle of Heinz chili sauce, and a batch of small ground beef meatballs, all simmered until the sauce reduced into a sticky, jewel-toned glaze. The jelly melted into the chili sauce and created something neither could achieve alone, a sweet, savory coating that clung to each meatball like lacquer. Guests speared them with colored toothpicks and ate standing up, leaving purple-tinged sauce spots on paper napkins. The recipe circulated through women's magazines and community cookbooks throughout the early 70s, credited to nobody in particular because everybody seemed to already know it. They cost almost nothing and disappeared from the tray within minutes. Before any casserole dish was necessary, before the oven needed heating, there was the ground beef and cabbage skillet. 1 burner, 20 minutes, almost nothing to wash. You browned the beef in cast iron, left enough fat in the pan, and added a head of cabbage cut into rough wedges. High heat first, stirring hard until the cabbage wilted and picked up color from the drippings. Then the flame went low, a splash of water went in, and the lid came down. By the time it was done, the cabbage had absorbed every bit of flavor from the beef and the fat below it, and the whole pan tasted like something far more deliberate than what went into it. German immigrant communities in Pennsylvania and the Midwest brought this combination of fried cabbage and ground meat from the old country in the 19th century. The dish fell away in the 1960s when cabbage acquired a working-class stigma it never deserved. Number 25. Tater Tot Casserole. You pressed raw ground beef seasoned with salt and pepper into the bottom of a 9x13 pan. Over that went a can of cream of mushroom soup, a layer of frozen mixed vegetables if you had them, and then a single layer of frozen tater tots lined up like little soldiers. 45 minutes at 375. The tots crisped on top while the soup melted into the beef below and turned everything into a savory paste that clung to every bite. It was the kind of meal that sounded ridiculous until you ate it, and then you made it every 2 weeks for the rest of your life. The Midwest claimed it, but by the late 70s it had shown up everywhere a freezer met a can opener. When General Mills launched Hamburger Helper in August 1971, ground beef had just climbed to 66 cents a pound, and the box promised to stretch 1 pound into a meal for 5. The first flavors, beef noodle, potato stroganoff, chili tomato, hash, and rice oriental, sold so fast that within 12 months, 27% of American households had bought at least 1 box. But thousands of home cooks had been making their own versions from scratch for years. The homemade method was nearly identical. Brown a pound of ground beef with diced onion, stir in dry pasta, add water or broth with paprika, garlic powder, and onion salt, then simmer until the noodles absorbed the liquid and turned thick. A handful of shredded cheddar stirred in at the end finished it. The scratch version cost less and tasted better, but convenience won the decade. By 1975, the Helping Hand mascot, a four-fingered talking glove, was as recognizable as Betty Crocker herself. Poor man's steak was never actually steak, and anyone who made it knew that, but the name was the point. You combined ground beef with crushed saltine crackers and a splash of water, pressed it into a baking pan until it was about an inch thick, covered it, and put it in the refrigerator overnight. The next morning, you cut it into 3-inch squares, dredged each piece in flour, seared them golden in a hot skillet, then transferred everything to a roasting pan, poured undiluted cream of mushroom soup straight over the top, and baked it low and slow for a full hour. The saltines held moisture in instead of letting it cook out, a technique from Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch country kitchens, documented in Mennonite community cookbooks since at least the 1930s, leaving patties that were tender all the way through and a gravy that required no additional effort. Families in Appalachian communities and across the rural Midwest made this dish through the Depression and into the 1950s without once thinking of it as poor food. They called it a square meal. That distinction mattered to them. It should still matter. Number 30. Shipwreck casserole. You layered everything raw in a baking dish and walked away. Ground beef on the bottom, then sliced potatoes, sliced onions, a can of kidney beans, a can of tomato soup, and salt and pepper. You put the lid on, slid it into the oven at 350, and left it alone for 90 minutes. No browning, no stirring, no watching. When you pulled it out, the meat had rendered into the beans and the potatoes were soft all the way through. The name came from the idea that you threw in whatever had not sunk yet. It cost almost nothing and fed a table of 5 without complaint. And nobody wrote it down because there was nothing to write. You just stacked things in a dish and let the oven do the thinking. Bisquick Impossible Cheeseburger Pie was the magic trick that launched 1,000 weeknight dinners. The recipe first appeared on the back of the Bisquick box around 1971, and Betty Crocker promoted it through her recipe card library that same year. The impossible part was the selling point. You poured a batter of Bisquick, milk, and eggs over seasoned ground beef and shredded cheddar in a pie plate, and the batter sank during baking to form its own crust. No rolling, no crimping, no pastry skills required. The filling was straightforward: browned ground beef with diced onion, a splash of Worcestershire sauce, salt and pepper. But topped with that self-forming golden crust and bubbling cheese, it looked like something that took real effort. At around 40 cents for the Bisquick and 60 cents for the beef, the whole pie cost barely over $1. It became the answer to what to make when company was coming, and there was nothing in the house but hamburger. Calico beans were the casserole that showed up at every Midwest potluck from the 1960s onward and never came with an explanation, because anyone who needed one wasn't the right audience. You browned ground beef with bacon cut into small pieces, then added 3 or 4 types of canned beans, kidney, navy, butter beans, sometimes baked beans straight from the can, and stirred everything into a sauce of ketchup, brown sugar, dry mustard, and apple cider vinegar. The combination sounded improbable until it hit the pot, at which point it was obvious that pork fat and brown sugar and 4 kinds of beans had always been meant to be together. It baked low and slow until the sauce thickened and every bean had absorbed everything around it. Versions appeared in Pillsbury Bake-Off community submissions in the late 1960s, and Midwest church cookbooks of that era document it so widely that the origin has been absorbed into the community itself. You brought it in a brown baking dish wrapped in a dish towel to keep it warm. Everyone came back for more. Nobody left with leftovers. But number 18. Cowboy beans with ground beef. You browned a pound of ground beef with diced onion, drained the grease, and stirred in 2 cans of pork and beans, a couple tablespoons of brown sugar, a squirt of yellow mustard, a splash of ketchup, and a few shakes of Worcestershire sauce. You poured it into a baking dish and let it go for an hour at 325. The beans turned dark and sticky, and the beef disappeared into them so completely that every spoonful had meat in it. This showed up at every backyard gathering in every small town in America, and the pan was always scraped clean before anything else on the table. The brown sugar caramelized around the edges of the dish and turned the top into a crust you could crack with a spoon. Every small town in Iowa seemed to have its own version, but loose meat sandwiches trace their origin to Ye Old Tavern in Sioux City, where a cook put seasoned, crumbled ground beef on a soft bun in 1924. By 1926, the Maid-Rite chain in Muscatine had turned the concept into a franchise, and by the early 1970s, loose meat was as much a part of the Iowa landscape as cornfields and county fairs. The sandwich was deceptively simple. Ground beef browned and crumbled fine, simmered in a splash of broth with Worcestershire sauce, then spooned onto a hamburger bun with pickles, mustard, and raw onion. No sauce, no sloppy Joe sweetness, just the clean taste of well-seasoned beef. The texture was everything, loose and crumbly, falling from the bun with every bite, requiring 2 hands and a pile of napkins. At Maid-Rite locations across the Midwest, a loose meat sandwich cost around 50 cents in 1971, making it the working man's lunch that never pretended to be anything fancier than what it was. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes showed up on the table when the week had run long and the money had run short, and it still felt like Sunday. You browned the ground beef in cast iron, worked a spoonful of flour into the meat, added water or thin milk, and let it bubble into a dark, thick gravy, scraping every caramelized bit off the bottom of the pan because those bits were the whole flavor. During the Depression years, when ground beef ran about 12 cents a pound at the corner butcher, this dish stretched a single purchase across 2 or 3 suppers. The potatoes went down first, hand-mashed with butter, and the gravy found every edge. She's gone now, and nobody has made pan gravy from scratch in that kitchen since the day she stopped cooking. Number 22. Ground beef and cabbage skillet. You shredded half a head of cabbage, browned a pound of ground beef in a big skillet, and tossed the cabbage right in with diced onion, a can of diced tomatoes, and a splash of vinegar. Covered, low heat, 20 minutes. The cabbage wilted down into the meat and the tomatoes made their own sauce. A full skillet fed 4 people for the cost of a head of cabbage and whatever beef was on sale. Polish families called it something different. German families called it something else. And everybody swore their mother's version was the original. The vinegar was the secret. It cut the heaviness of the beef fat and kept the cabbage from tasting flat. Cowboy casserole carried the swagger of the American Southwest straight into suburban kitchens of the early 1970s. The dish layered browned ground beef with canned baked beans, barbecue sauce, and shredded cheddar, then crowned everything with refrigerated Pillsbury biscuit dough before the whole thing went into the oven until golden. It thrived in the Midwest and South, showing up at school cafeterias, 4-H suppers, and anywhere families gathered with big appetites and small budgets. Some versions folded in diced tomatoes or taco seasoning. Others kept it simple, just beef, beans, and biscuits, the holy trinity of weeknight survival. The biscuit top was the genius, puffing up to create a golden lid that sealed in all the smoky, beefy steam underneath. Kids tore into it without being told twice, and adults went back for seconds without apology. Ground beef tamale pie was what happened when the Southwest met the Depression and neither one backed down. You made a cornmeal mush, cornmeal stirred into boiling salted water until thick. Spread half across the bottom and up the sides of a greased baking dish, filled it with spiced ground beef, onion, canned tomatoes, kidney beans, and chili powder, then spread the remaining mush over the top as a crust and baked it until the cornmeal firmed into something you could lift in wedges. Texas Extension Service bulletins in the 1930s documented tamale pie as a formal budget protein strategy, and it stayed in regular rotation through the 1960s across the South and Southwest. It was the working-class answer to the tamale, all the flavor of masa and spiced filling without the labor of wrapping individual portions. You knew it was ready when the crust went from wet pale to golden dry at the edges. Number 24. Johnny Marzetti. It came out of an Italian restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, and the name stuck to the dish long after most people forgot who the Marzetti family was. This casserole spread across church kitchens and school cafeterias faster than any recipe card could travel. You browned ground beef with onion and celery, stirred in a can of tomato soup and a can of tomato sauce, then folded in cooked elbow macaroni and a fistful of shredded cheddar. Into a casserole dish it went, more cheese on top, and 20 minutes in the oven. Every Midwestern potluck between here and Dayton had at least one version of Johnny Marzetti on the table, and the pans always came back empty. The celery was the signature, that faint crunch underneath the soft noodles that told you someone had made it from scratch. The aroma of green peppers softening in tomato sauce filled the kitchen with a smell that was equal parts savory and slightly sweet. And for families in the early 1970s, it meant stuffed green pepper casserole was in the oven. The original stuffed peppers required careful hollowing, blanching, and individual filling, which was more fuss than most weeknight cooks could manage. So somebody, the credit has been claimed by dozens of community cookbooks from Pennsylvania to Nebraska, had the genius idea of deconstructing the whole thing into a casserole. Diced green peppers, browned ground beef, cooked rice, canned tomato soup, and shredded cheese all went into a baking dish together, layered or stirred depending on the household. 30 minutes at 350 degrees produced the same flavors without the architecture. The casserole version fed more people, reheated better, and didn't collapse on the plate the way individual stuffed peppers always seem to. It was a perfect example of how 1970s home cooks valued practicality over presentation. American chop suey was what New England called it, slumgullion in Maine, Johnny Marzetti in Ohio, American goulash everywhere else. But whatever you called it, you recognized the smell the moment the onion hit the pan. Ground beef browned with onion, elbow macaroni added dry, canned tomatoes and water poured over, the lid on and the flame turned low until the pasta had absorbed most of the liquid and the beef had dissolved into every bite. It's documented as far back as 1938 in Northeast cookbooks, shaped by Italian-American one-pot cooking and the Depression need for something filling and cheap. Campbell's tomato soup became the 1950s shortcut, and nobody was embarrassed about it. What's been lost isn't the recipe. It's the smell of it on a Tuesday evening in a small kitchen, filling the whole apartment with the certainty that the week was going to be all right. Number 17. Beef enchilada casserole. You browned ground beef, stirred in a can of enchilada sauce and a can of drained beans, then layered it in a baking dish with torn corn tortillas and shredded cheddar. 3 layers, sauce on top, more cheese, and 30 minutes in the oven. It was enchiladas without the rolling, which meant you could make it in 10 minutes of active work and still put something on the table that tasted like you had been in the kitchen all afternoon. The tortillas softened into the sauce and turned almost silky, and the edges where the cheese hit the hot glass crisped into little chips. That crispy cheese edge was the part everybody fought over, and the smart ones cut their portion from the corner of the pan where there was more of it. Hamburger soup got made when the beef supply was nearly gone and the cellar still had things in it. A turnip, dried beans, 3 potatoes past their best. You browned whatever ground beef remained, even a quarter pound, in the bottom of the largest pot in the house, and stretched it with whatever the root cellar offered. The broth was thin, built from water and a bouillon cube, thickened by nothing but a 2-hour simmer. What came up from the pot wasn't rich, but it was hot. It filled the bowl and it tasted like something, like cast iron and turnip and the faint sweetness of a carrot that had gone soft on one end. Farm kitchens across the Midwest kept some version of this going on the back burner all through the 1930s and 40s. There was no recipe, just a pot and what you had left. Number 27. Poor man's steak. You mixed a pound of ground beef with crushed saltine crackers, 1 egg, salt, pepper, and a little milk until it held together like dough. Then you shaped it into oval patties about 1/2 inch thick and dredged them in flour. You browned them in a hot skillet, set them aside, and made gravy in the same pan with the drippings, more flour, and milk. The patties went back in and simmered in that gravy for 20 minutes. It tasted close enough to chicken fried steak that nobody at the table felt poor. The crackers were doing the heavy lifting, stretching a pound of meat into 6 patties instead of 4, and the gravy hid any difference. That was the whole point. If you grew up within 100 miles of Iowa, you knew the loose meat sandwich, not from a recipe, but because someone set it in front of you without explanation, as if there was nothing unusual about a bun filled with crumbled steamed beef that held together by nothing. The meat was supposed to fall out. Ye Olde Tavern in Sioux City invented the form in 1924. Maid-Rite in Muscatine spread it across the Midwest 2 years later. You never formed a patty. The beef stayed loose through the whole process, steamed in its own juices, which kept it tender in a way pan-frying never could. You never measured the seasoning. You tasted it before it went on the bun. If you had to ask how much salt, you weren't ready to make it. Iowa still serves it. Most of the country has never heard of it. 30 suppers built from the same 1 pound of ground beef and whatever else was already in the kitchen. Brown the meat tonight. Not the fanciest dish on this list, just the one that sounds like an ordinary Tuesday at the table you grew up at. Dice the onion, heat the skillet, and sit down when you eat. Not at the counter. If one of these brought back a memory, tell me which one in the comments. I am James, and I will see you in the next one.